If you ever thought someone could be perfect, just wait until you realize how carefully they hide their claws. When I first moved into Maplewood Lane, I thought I'd found a little slice of heaven. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes on Sunday mornings, neighbors who waved from porches. It all felt like something out of a movie. And then there was him, David. Tall, polite, always impeccably dressed, with a smile that could make anyone believe he was a good man. Everyone adored him. Everyone, that is, except me. Though at first I didn't know why. I had just started dating Alex when we met him. David would pop over with a bottle of wine, give us the friendly neighborly advice, and leave, always seeming harmless. Alex was charmed instantly. I tried to be polite, but there was something about the way David watched me, like he was cataloging my every move. That left a shiver down my spine. I chalked it up to paranoia at first. Maybe it was just my protective instincts kicking in. But then the little things started. A casual comment here, a helpful suggestion there. At first, I didn't notice how insidious they were. David would casually mention that Alex had been seen talking to an old coworker or joking about spending less time at home. I laughed them off, thinking Alex wouldn't take them seriously, but he did. I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the flicker of insecurity. David seemed to ignite effortlessly. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. David couldn't possibly be this manipulative, right? But deep down, I couldn't shake it. Every smile, every polite wave, every neighborly favor started to feel like a trap. And the worst part was, nobody else saw it. Everyone loved him, everyone trusted him. I felt like I was the crazy one, like I was losing my mind while he walked around, perfect and untouchable. One evening, after Alex and I had a particularly heated argument, one that I realized later had been subtly influenced by David, I sat on our porch, staring at his house across the street. Light spilled from his windows, laughter echoing faintly from his living room. Perfect neighbor, perfect life. But I was starting to see the cracks, and I knew then that I wouldn't let him get away with destroying what I had, silently, behind his carefully constructed mask. That night, I made a decision I never thought I would. If the neighborhood adored him, then I would turn their admiration into a weapon. I would uncover the truth, and I would expose the man who thought he could play with people's lives without consequence. But first, I had to learn exactly how deep his deception ran. I remember the first time I saw the real David, though at the time I didn't know it. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Alex had gone out to grab groceries. I stayed behind, tidying up the kitchen and trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping over me for weeks. That's when David showed up at the door, holding a pie like a friendly neighborly gift. "Thought you might enjoy this," he said, his smile effortless, like sunshine spilling over the threshold. I forced a polite smile and accepted it, telling myself I was overreacting. But then he lingered. Too long, and that's when it started. Subtle jabs masked as concern. He commented on Alex's late nights at work, implying that he might be neglecting me. He asked if I was really sure Alex was being honest about his weekend plans. His tone was gentle, almost caring, but the seed of doubt was planted. I felt it worming its way into my mind before I even realized it. Days passed, and the subtle attacks grew. Small rumors David spread, small lies cleverly twisted to make me question Alex's loyalty. A neighbor mentioned seeing Alex flirting with someone at the grocery store, though they couldn't remember exactly who. Another casually mentioned that Alex had been talking about taking a break. Every hint, every casual whisper traced back to David. I started noticing the way he watched me and Alex, his perfect smile hiding the satisfaction he got from our tiny cracks. I confronted Alex about it once. "Did you say something to him, or mention us?" I asked hesitantly. He shrugged, confused. "No, why would I?" But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way David's poison had already started to take hold. And when he brushed it off, I realized something chilling. David didn't have to lie directly. He didn't have to confess to anything. He only needed to nudge, manipulate, and let the gossip do the rest. By the time Alex returned that evening, I felt myself retreating. I was cautious now, measuring every word, every glance. I couldn't tell if Alex had actually started to believe David. or if he was just trying not to fight. And David, of course, was always there, offering advice, smiling, helping with a broken fence. Perfect neighbor, perfect manipulator. It was then I realized something crucial. I wasn't just fighting to protect my relationship. I was fighting for my own sanity. If I didn't stop David, if I didn't expose him somehow, I would lose more than Alex. I would lose myself. That night, I sat by the window, watching David's house across the street, the warm light spilling like a trap. And I promised myself one thing: I would find his weakness. I would figure out exactly who he really was, behind the perfect mask. And when I did, he wouldn't get away with it. The first real crack in my relationship came sooner than I expected, and it hit harder than anything I could have prepared for. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where everything feels ordinary until it isn't. Alex had been unusually quiet all day, checking his phone too often, his brow furrowed in a way I hadn't seen in months. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe work was stressful, but deep down, I felt a familiar prick of unease. Then David appeared. Of course he did. He arrived coincidentally, claiming to check on some minor fence repair he had promised Alex he'd help with. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew his visit wasn't innocent. That smile, that casual charm, it carried the weight of subtle malice I was beginning to recognize. "Alex, I was just telling Susan," he glanced at me, voice dripping with feigned concern, "that you seemed a little distant lately. Is everything okay between you two?" Alex froze, glancing at me as if the question had just opened a window into a world I didn't even know existed. My stomach twisted. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But David didn't leave it there. He lingered in the doorway, nodding slowly, as though silently confirming to himself that the seed of doubt had been planted. Later that night, after David had gone, Alex brought it up. "Do you think I've been distant?" His voice was hesitant, almost fragile. I tried to reassure him, but the words sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I realized then how carefully David had done his work. Not one lie, not one accusation, just the perfect question at the perfect time to make Alex doubt his own feelings and mine. The tension that followed was suffocating. Every interaction, every laugh, every affectionate glance felt scrutinized, poisoned. I caught Alex hesitating when I reached for his hand, as if second-guessing his own desire to connect. I felt my heart breaking in real time, watching him unravel without even knowing why. And David was the ghost in the room, invisible yet present in every shadow. By the weekend, I knew I had to act, but I didn't know how. I tried reasoning with Alex, tried to point out David's subtle manipulations. But how do you explain something no one else can see? How do you convince someone that a man loved and respected by everyone around him is the source of their growing paranoia? That's when I realized the truth. David thrived because he was invisible. Nobody suspected him, nobody questioned him. If I wanted to stop him, I couldn't just confront him. I had to prove him. I had to find the evidence that would expose his carefully curated life. For the lie, it really was. And in that moment, as I sat alone in our living room with Alex asleep beside me, I made a vow. I wasn't going to let this man destroy us. Not quietly, not invisibly, not ever. I would learn his secrets, I would gather every scrap of proof, and I would turn the neighborhood's admiration into his undoing. Because if David thought he could manipulate lives from behind a perfect smile, he had no idea I was about to show him just how dangerous a wronged woman could be. I started paying attention to David, the way a detective studies a suspect. Though I had no formal training, only instinct, fury, and a need for justice. At first, it was subtle things. How he lingered a little too long in conversations. The way his eyes would dart around when he thought no one was watching. The faint smirk that appeared when he noticed Alex's discomfort. Every detail mattered. I began keeping a mental log, noting patterns, times, and interactions. The more I watched, the more I realized that David wasn't just meddling, he was orchestrating, a puppeteer pulling strings from behind a mask that no one dared question. I even started using my phone discreetly, snapping pictures when he left our porch after a friendly visit, capturing the way he would casually talk to neighbors and insert those subtle seeds of doubt. One moment, he'd be complimenting Mrs. Harper's garden. The next, he'd be leaning in to whisper something about Alex, looking distracted lately. I could see it, crystal clear, and yet everyone else remained blind. Then came the first real hint of the man behind the mask. One afternoon, while retrieving the mail, I saw David talking to someone, in hushed tones near the corner of the street. I couldn't hear the words, but I noticed his fingers tapping impatiently, a rare flicker of frustration crossing his perfect features. He wasn't calm, he wasn't charming, he was calculating, anxious even, about something he didn't want anyone else to know. That night, I went through my mental notes and pieced together a pattern. Every small argument Alex and I had, every shadow of doubt that crept into our relationship, traced back to David's timing and coincidental interventions. It was meticulous, surgical, and it was personal. He didn't just want to control our lives, he wanted to break us quietly, invisibly, in a way no one would suspect him. I realized then that this wouldn't be a simple confrontation. If I wanted to protect Alex, myself, and the life we'd built, I had to step into his game. I had to learn everything, his habits, his weaknesses, the way he presented himself to the world, versus what he hid behind closed doors. And I had to do it without tipping him off. That night, I started a journal, not for therapy, not for reflection, but for strategy. I wrote down every interaction, every odd comment, every moment that made me doubt him. I began connecting the dots, mapping David's influence like a spider web. Each thread led back to him, and I could almost hear the sound of his perfect mask cracking in my mind. By the end of that week, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. David had underestimated me. He assumed I would shrink under pressure, assumed the neighborhood's admiration meant he was untouchable. But I wasn't shrinking, I was learning, I was planning. And soon, very soon, the perfect neighbor wouldn't know what hit him. I decided the only way to understand David fully was to bait him, to create situations that would force him to reveal himself. Without realizing he was being watched. It was risky, but I was desperate. The first test was simple. I exaggerated a minor insecurity with Alex, something I knew David had already noticed. That afternoon, while Alex was out running errands, I called David under the pretense of asking for advice. I made my voice just a little shaky, let slip that Alex seemed distracted lately, that maybe he wasn't as committed as I thought. I watched him closely from the window, pretending to tidy the living room. His reaction was subtle but immediate. He smiled, that infuriatingly perfect smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He leaned forward slightly, as though absorbing the information. For his own amusement, a flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but there. He was enjoying this. Then came the real test. I left an envelope addressed to him, casually slipped through his mailbox, with nothing but a few carefully worded lines, implying that everyone notices the little things. It was vague, harmless on the surface, but enough to see if he would react. Within hours, he was at my door, bright and calm, pretending nothing had happened, but I noticed the twitch in his hand. The way his eyes darted around the porch. He was on edge, and that small reaction thrilled me. It was the first crack I'd seen in his perfect facade. Over the next few days, I increased the subtle tests, casual comments to neighbors, questions about his work that I knew he didn't like answering, dropping hints about seeing him helping Alex behind my back. Each time, I watched, noted, and adjusted my approach. David was always careful, always maintaining appearances, but I could see the strain. The mask wasn't as flawless as everyone thought. And the more I observed, the more I realized that his manipulation wasn't limited to Alex. He thrived on control, on twisting perception, on playing with people's emotions like a master chess player. The neighborhood's admiration wasn't a shield. It was a tool he used to amplify his influence. If I could turn that tool against him, the effect would be devastating. By the end of the week, I had the beginnings of a map, not of his routines exactly, but of his tactics, his psychological weaknesses, and the invisible threads he used to manipulate everyone around him. I could see the lines, the connections, and the leverage points. David had underestimated me. He thought he was untouchable, a flawless puppet master, but he hadn't counted on me noticing the strings. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet hum of Maplewood Lane, I felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was stepping into dangerous territory, but for the first time since moving here, I felt a spark of control. And I knew one thing: David's perfect life was about to start unraveling, and I would be the one pulling the threads. The breakthrough came completely by accident, though in hindsight it seemed inevitable. I had been keeping a careful eye on David for weeks, tracking his subtle manipulations, cataloging interactions, and testing his reactions. One evening, while taking a shortcut through the alley behind our houses, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat: a small, unmarked envelope tucked between the trash bins outside David's garage. Curious and admittedly reckless, I picked it up. Inside were a few photographs and what looked like receipts, notes, and little scraps of evidence. Mundane at first glance, but when I studied them, I realized they painted a very different picture of David than the one the neighborhood adored. He wasn't just meddling in people's lives, he was hiding a parallel existence. There were pictures of meetings with unknown people, unexplained transactions, and subtle references to lies he had told neighbors, friends, even Alex and me. It was proof that his charm was a mask, and behind it was a man meticulously orchestrating the perception of perfection. I spent the night going over every detail, cross-referencing it with the patterns I'd already observed. Slowly, a web emerged. David had been manipulating not just my relationship, but multiple families on the street, always presenting himself as helpful, generous, indispensable. And the most terrifying part, he was careful enough that no one suspected a thing, except me. That night, lying in bed, I felt a surge of both fear and empowerment. For the first time, I held real leverage. I could expose him, reveal the lies that had been quietly poisoning our lives. I could protect Alex, protect myself, and dismantle the perfect facade that had fooled everyone for so long. But I also knew I had to be careful. David was clever. He had spent years perfecting his image, and if he sensed I was onto him, he could destroy any evidence, manipulate perception, and turn everyone against me instead. I needed a plan, a methodical strategy, to use what I had found without tipping him off. I spent the next few days observing him even more closely, noticing subtle reactions when he thought no one was looking, a hurried glance at his phone, a slight hesitation when a neighbor asked a question, a faintly frustrated exhale as he left his house. The man who everyone trusted without question was human after all, vulnerable in ways I had only just begun to understand. By the weekend, I had made a decision. I wasn't just going to gather evidence. I was going to set a trap. Carefully, quietly, I would construct a situation that forced David to reveal his true self, in front of the people who trusted him most. And when that moment came, there would be no escape. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. The perfect neighbor, the charming manipulator, was about to meet someone who refused to be fooled, and I intended to see him fall. Piece by piece, in the neighborhood that had once worshipped him. I started small and quiet, because the safest traps are the ones that look like accidents. First, I made allies without calling them that. I became the neighbor who noticed things, an intentional role, practiced until it felt like second nature. I pulled Mrs. Harper aside while she was pruning roses and asked, with the kind of coy concern people trust, whether she'd seen anyone, acting odd near her back fence. "Just a stray cat," she said, then frowned at the memory and admitted she'd seen a man with a briefcase late last week. I didn't press. I let the idea sit in her mind like a seed I'd already watered. With Mr. Lee from next door, I offered to pick up a package. If he was expecting one, when I dropped it off, I asked casually if the delivery guy had seemed hurried or nervous. He laughed it off, but later mentioned that a few envelopes had gone missing from the street mail recently. Little acknowledgments, little nudges. Nobody needed to know why I was asking. I also befriended the mail carrier, which felt ethically gray, borderline, but I told myself it was about protection, not espionage. I complimented her shoes, asked about her route, and let the conversation drift, until she mentioned odd drop-offs at David's house. "Sometimes he's not home, sometimes someone else picks them up," she said, rolling her eyes. It was the kind of casual detail that could be dismissed unless someone listened twice. At the same time, I started to stage coincidences. I left an extra newspaper on my porch and made a point of reading a headline out loud right when David walked by. Something about neighborhood watch meetings or community volunteering. He always paused, smiled, and nodded. And I watched for any twitch that betrayed impatience. I purposefully invited Alex to host a small weekend barbecue. The kind of low-key neighborhood event David used as a stage to perform his generosity. The guest list was careful, people who liked him, people who didn't know him well, people whose casual testimony might later matter. I told no one the real reason I wanted them there. The barbecue looked like a gift to the block. It was actually the first scene of a play I'd written. Guilt crawled up sometimes. I'm not proud of everything I did. Manipulation to expose manipulation felt correct in my head, but it didn't remove the taste of iron. At the back of my throat, I worried about what laying a trap would do to people I'd come to like, about dragging friends into a conflict. That might become ugly. And every night, when Alex and I lay in bed and he shifted away from me, the worry sharpened. If this failed, I could lose him forever. If it succeeded, I'd have to live with what I'd done to bring him back. So I kept the plan surgical. I collected what I could from David's trash without being noticed. I photographed meetings at odd hours. I took notes of odd people who came to his door and left in cars with out-of-state plates. I made sure every little hint I planted with neighbors matched something tangible I could show later. The goal was not to ruin a man for the thrill of it. It was to reveal the man who had been quietly breaking lives while wearing everyone's trust like armor. The barbecue approached like an inevitable tide. I watched the sky as if it were a character in the story, willing it to hold off rain. Inside, Alex hummed while arranging napkins, blissfully unaware of the architecture of deceit I was assembling around our street. David arrived on time, of course. Arms loaded with wine and compliments, he settled into the role of host the neighborhood loved. But this time, the audience was watching. For something different, I was watching the moment he overreached. The barbecue started like any other neighborhood gathering, laughter spilling from backyards, kids chasing each other in a circle, the smell of grilled chicken and burgers mingling with late summer air. David arrived, as predicted, with a bottle of vintage wine and a perfectly timed joke, earning nods and smiles from everyone around. To the casual observer, it looked like the man was doing what he did best, charming the neighborhood. But I was watching closely, notebook in hand. Alex by my side, and neighbors engaged in casual conversation I had subtly steered. The first small crack appeared when David tried to corner Mrs. Harper. In a discussion about neighborhood donations, I had tipped her off, lightly, to ask a pointed question about one of his past charitable efforts. During the barbecue, at first she laughed, politely, unsure of how to approach the question. David's smile faltered ever so slightly, his voice tight, but he recovered, chuckling and redirecting the conversation. Still, I noted the tiny tremor in his hand. A small victory, invisible to everyone else but me. Next, I watched his interactions with the mail carrier, whom I had casually invited to the barbecue under the guise of thanking her for her route diligence. She approached him quietly, dropping a comment about how some envelopes had gone missing in the neighborhood recently. "Just little things," she said, giving him a conspiratorial glance. David's perfect composure wavered for a split second. His jaw tightened, and he hesitated as if recalculating his next move. I caught the subtle flicker of panic in his eyes, and my pulse quickened. He wasn't invincible. The real turning point came when I orchestrated a small group chat among a few neighbors. I'd subtly prepped with snippets of information. One by one, they asked casual questions about his volunteer work, his late-night visitors, and the mysterious receipts someone had noticed at his doorstep. David, sensing the pattern forming, tried to charm, deflect, and control the narrative. But the cracks were now widening too quickly to contain. By the end of the evening, I could see it. The perfect neighbor was sweating, forcing smiles that didn't reach his eyes. Whispers passed among the neighbors as subtle observations were made, almost imperceptible, yet coordinated. David was used to being adored without question, and suddenly the tide had shifted. The very network he relied on to maintain his facade. The community's blind trust was beginning to notice inconsistencies as the last guests left and the laughter faded into quiet streets. I sat on the porch with Alex, who didn't yet fully grasp the chess game I'd begun. I whispered a soft reassurance that we were still safe, still together, and that what he thought was ordinary chaos was actually the beginning of the unmasking. That night, David closed his door behind him. With a little more force than usual, the shadow of frustration lingering on his otherwise composed face. And for the first time, I felt the satisfaction of knowing I was no longer powerless. The perfect neighbor had underestimated me, and his carefully constructed world was beginning to tremble in ways he could not control. David's first real mistake came the very next morning, though he didn't realize it yet. I watched from my window as he paced in his driveway, phone pressed to his ear, voice low but clipped. There was tension in his posture that I hadn't seen before, a man who had spent years cultivating perfection, now betraying the strain of maintaining it. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. Every movement, every sharp glance over his shoulder, told me that he knew something had shifted. Then the emails started. Not to me, not directly, but to neighbors I'd subtly looped in. "There's been some confusion," one read. "Please disregard any rumors you may have heard." Another, typed in haste, hinted at missing documentation, half-heartedly trying to explain discrepancies in his neighborhood work and charity efforts. He was scrambling, and in his scramble, he was leaving traces. I wasn't the only one noticing. At the corner cafe later that day, I overheard neighbors whispering someone had spotted a briefcase, supposedly just deliveries, being handled in ways inconsistent with David's stories. Mrs. Harper mentioned a late-night visitor, who didn't match the profile of his claimed volunteer contacts. Each piece alone might have been dismissed, but together, like puzzle pieces, they began forming a picture too vivid to ignore. David made another critical error that afternoon. He tried to confront one of the neighbors directly, to charm them into silence, to redirect suspicion. But in his haste, he misremembered a detail, contradicting a small, carefully noted observation I had planted days earlier. That contradiction spread quickly, whispered in casual conversations and small encounters. One by one, the neighbors began to question the narrative they had believed for so long. Meanwhile, I continued my quiet documentation, photographing interactions, noting reactions, keeping meticulous records. Each flinch, each forced laugh, each glance over his shoulder became evidence. I didn't have to attack him directly. I just had to let the inconsistencies speak for themselves, and they were speaking loudly, in ways he couldn't control. By evening, I saw the panic. David's perfect posture slumped slightly, the ease of his smile replaced by a tight line of tension. He was no longer the untouchable figure everyone admired. The neighborhood that had once adored him was starting to whisper, doubt, question, and I, from my carefully observed perch, felt a strange thrill, a mixture of vindication and fear, knowing that the web he had spun around us all was unraveling thread by thread. That night, as I sat with Alex, I didn't reveal the full extent of what was happening. He still needed to believe that everything was manageable, that we weren't yet in the middle of the storm I had orchestrated. But inside, I knew. The first domino had fallen. David's carefully curated life, built on charm and manipulation, was cracking. And soon, the truth would spill over, unstoppable, into the streets he had so carefully controlled. The unraveling accelerated faster than I could have dared hope. It began with whispers, small conversations that grew louder each day. A neighbor mentioned David's late-night volunteer work to someone else. Someone else recalled seeing unmarked packages he had claimed were donations. I let these casual exchanges flow naturally, never inserting myself directly, only watching and taking careful notes. Each revelation, each realization by someone else, chipped away at his flawless image. Then came the confrontation that changed everything. It was Mrs. Harper, the gentle woman who always smiled at David's jokes, who finally questioned him outright in front of the block. "David," she asked, voice steady but curious, "I noticed some things about your charity work and deliveries. Can you explain? He blinked, surprised, faltering for just a second that stretched like an eternity. He tried to recover with charm, with deflection, with humor, but the cracks were too obvious. He mumbled explanations, glanced around nervously, and in doing so, contradicted facts. Several neighbors had quietly confirmed days before. The domino effect was immediate. Eyes widened, murmurs spread, subtle nods of doubt rippled through the crowd. David's smooth performance collapsed under the weight of collective scrutiny. I watched from a careful distance, noting every gesture, every quiver in his voice. He tried to regain control, to charm the neighbors, into believing him, but trust once fractured is not easily repaired. Meanwhile, I shared what I had gathered with a few neighbors. I had quietly confided in emails, photographs, and records of his manipulations. With tangible proof, the skepticism turned into alarm. People started talking more openly, confronting inconsistencies, questioning stories they had previously accepted without hesitation. David's carefully maintained image was no longer untouchable, it was vulnerable. That night, I saw him from my window, pacing his living room. In agitation, the perfect neighbor's mask shattered, replaced by frustration and fear. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. This wasn't about vengeance for its own sake anymore. This was about justice, exposing a man who had spent years quietly destabilizing lives, under the guise of charm and benevolence. And I realized something else, watching him unravel in front of the neighborhood. Feeling the shift in balance, I felt a catharsis I hadn't expected. The power he had wielded so effortlessly was slipping. And I was the catalyst. I had taken my fear, my anger, my hurt, and turned it into something decisive, methodical, and unassailable. By the next morning, David was a different man to the neighborhood. He still smiled, but the eyes betrayed him. Exhausted, calculating, cornered. The whispers had grown into conversations, conversations into questions, and questions into a quiet but undeniable shift in how he was perceived. I sat with Alex, letting him see the smallest hints of triumph, careful not to reveal the full extent of the strategy I had employed. Soon, very soon, David would have nowhere to hide, and the neighborhood's admiration, the very armor he had trusted, would be the force that destroyed him. The confrontation came on a Saturday afternoon at a small block gathering I had orchestrated under the guise of a casual barbecue. The sun was warm, the air scented with grilled food, and neighbors were scattered around, chatting politely, but the atmosphere had changed. There was tension, curiosity, and a subtle anticipation that something was about to break. David arrived, arms loaded with wine, and a basket of pastries, smiling as if nothing had shifted. But I could see it immediately. He was cautious, measuring every face, every glance, searching for signs that his perfect performance was still intact. The neighborhood's eyes weren't soft with admiration anymore. They were sharp with suspicion. I started gently, mentioning in passing that some of the neighborhood correspondents had raised questions, casually implying that a few things weren't adding up. David tried his usual charm, redirecting attention, cracking a joke, even managing a forced laugh. But then Mrs. Harper, with quiet courage, asked the first pointed question. "David, could you explain why some of the donations you mentioned never appeared at the community center?" she asked, her voice calm but unwavering. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the small crowd. I could see David's jaw tighten. The practiced ease of his smile faltered, just for a moment. That moment was all it took. One by one, neighbors started sharing observations they had kept to themselves, late-night visitors. No one could identify discrepancies in his charitable claims, strange patterns in his errands and meetings. I handed Mrs. Harper a small folder. I had compiled photographs, notes, emails, all clear evidence of David's manipulations. His reaction was immediate and telling. The smile vanished entirely, replaced by disbelief, then anger, then a frantic attempt to explain himself. Every word contradicted another. Every excuse fell flat under the weight of the evidence. The neighborhood watched, silent but engaged, as the man they had trusted for years unraveled in real time. Alex reached for my hand, steadying me as I watched the transformation. David's voice, once confident and controlling, wavered. He stumbled, gestured nervously, and finally retreated. The mask of perfection shattered. The neighbors were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses to the truth. Their admiration turned into scrutiny. Their trust reducted from a manipulator to the victims of his quiet sabotage. By the end of the afternoon, David had no place left to hide. He closed his door behind him that evening with a forceful slam, a gesture I felt more than heard. And I realized something profound. The perfect neighbor had relied on everyone's ignorance, and once that was gone, so was his power. Sitting quietly with Alex as the street returned to its usual calm, I felt both exhaustion and relief. The battle was over, though the echoes of it would linger. David's life was irrevocably altered, his manipulations exposed to everyone who once blindly trusted him. And for the first time in months, I felt a weight lift, the knowledge that justice, carefully planned and patiently executed, had been done. The days after the confrontation were quiet, almost eerily so. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, as though a shadow that had hovered over us all had finally lifted. Conversations were no longer polite smiles and casual nods. They carried awareness, subtle acknowledgement that the perfect neighbor was no longer perfect at all. Alex and I walked together down the street for the first time without tension, holding hands openly, laughing without that underlying caution that David had imposed on our lives. It was a relief I hadn't realized I had been craving. The fear that had kept me on edge, the constant doubt seeded by someone else's manipulation, had finally dissipated. But it wasn't only relief. I felt something else too, a complicated mixture of satisfaction and unease. Exposing David had been necessary, but it had also required me to step into shadows, to manipulate subtly, to orchestrate situations that could have easily backfired. I remembered each calculated question, every careful nudge, every small trap, and I understood that I had become a strategist. In a battle of wills I never anticipated. Neighbors occasionally glanced at me differently, a subtle recognition that I had played a part in what had happened. Some offered smiles of gratitude, others kept their distance, unsure of how to process the change in dynamics. I didn't mind. What mattered was that the truth had come to light, and no one, not even the most charming manipulator, could hide behind false perfection again. Alex squeezed my hand one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the street glow under the soft lights of dusk. "I don't think I realized how much we were being manipulated," he said softly. You saved us, really." I shook my head, a small, bittersweet smile on my lips. "I didn't save anyone. I just made sure the truth came out. We did this, we survived it together." And in that moment, I understood that the neighborhood, once a backdrop to fear and deception, had become a stage for resilience and awareness. David's downfall wasn't just his own. It was a lesson to everyone around him, a reminder that no one, no matter how charming, could manipulate lives without consequence when vigilance and courage were applied. Life began to settle. Alex and I rebuilt our routines, our trust, and our peace. I still watched the street sometimes, instinctively, but now it was curiosity, not suspicion. I knew that what I had done would linger as a story the neighborhood remembered, a tale of a perfect facade shattered by persistence, observation, and the quiet determination of someone who refused to be broken. And as I closed my eyes at night, the lingering tension of months melted away. Justice had been served, not loudly, not vindictively, but with precision. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully, quietly, unshakably free. Thank you for witnessing my story and walking this path with me. Sometimes survival requires more than love. It requires courage, patience, and the refusal to be unseen.